I presume the audio is all good this far away. Cool, thank you. Is my audio on so I can hear? Jack, can you turn my audio on to full so I can hear it? They ask me POIs.
With that. Sorry.
There we go. Now I should be able to hear if they POI. Oh, then I can take two, it's fine. All right. The internationalization of news and the resulting death of local news has been a disaster for people's information diets. It hasn't given them the information that's relevant to them, and that is both on an important political level, which I'm sure will get discussed a lot in this debate, but it's also on a more mundane level, giving them the information that they need for their everyday lives. What are the local economic conditions? What are the PSAs that the government is trying to put out? And that is information that is incredibly important. I'm going to start with some setup and then launch into three arguments. First, what does it mean to prefer? Obviously, what it is to prefer is to some degree amorphous. So we're going to define this as OG. We think that preferring it is to say that we would prefer if this was people's primary news sources. Obviously, both can exist to some degree, but we would prefer if this was people's primary news sources, which would in turn drive demand and then mean that that was who had more money and who was more likely to exist into the long term. The thing I'd note here is that local newspapers need quite a high degree of being preferred in order to exist because they exist at a far lower scale, whereas international newspapers are likely to survive well on either side. If anyone thinks that's a grossly unfair definition, I'm happy to take it with clarification, but otherwise I think the debate should exist like as everyone expects it to, which is to say, what is a better form of news? Secondly, what is the comparative of international news? Because it's almost never global news. It is still international. You are getting it from countries that are generally aligned with your country. That is for three reasons. First, there are language barriers, which means you're generally getting news from places that have similar languages, which generally align politically as well. Secondly, ideologically, you generally want to read news from people that agree with you. And third, people read things from international papers that they perceive to be from the same parts of the world that they are. So the reason that Australians are more likely to read the New York Times than they are to read Al Jazeera is that we perceive the United States to be part of a sort of common white heritage that we as Australians have, which is why you're almost never reading global news on their side. And any argument from opposition bench, which establishes why you would, for instance, break down silos of information is unlikely to work. Those silos get bigger, but you still divide the world just on a bigger scale. Three arguments. First, why you get more relevant information. Secondly, why we get better international news. And thirdly, why we get more soft power. PIs in the chat, please. So, more relevant information. Why is it that these papers on a local level are more likely to provide relevant information? Firstly, that is because they have the capacity for two reasons. First, the reporters who are hired to them simply have more knowledge about the local area. And secondly, they have more capacity to engage with sources. Because sometimes you physically need to be at the press conference to ask a question. You physically need to be there to meet a source. You need to go to the protest to talk to people. And that is incredibly important. But secondly, they have more incentive to provide local news. First, because it's catering to their markets, so they're more likely to be profitable. And secondly, because they care about it. To some degree, journalists have agency over what they talk about. And when they care more about local issues, they're far more likely to cover it. What are the impacts of you getting more local good information? First, on politics. It means, first of all, people have more knowledge about what is happening politically around them, which means people vote better, governments act better. But secondly, there's more accountability for public figures, so they're less likely to act badly. So when you have a local newspaper covering regional politics, it's less likely the mayor of your regional town can get away with embezzlement and bribery when there are investigations in that. But secondly, we're talking about everyday information. We're talking about local economic conditions. What is happening in the housing market? How likely is it that you should be able to quit your job and start your own business because of that information? It's information about local scams. It's information about where to get your flu shot. All of this is incredibly important. I think that's CO. I'll take you.
Yep. Is your conception of this that there are like newspapers that are isolated to your particular municipality or village, and it's that level of specificity?
So obviously it happens at different scales. You have some cases in which you have, so the North Shore Times, which is for my suburb, the North Shore. Sometimes you have the Sydney Morning Herald, which is for my city, which is Sydney. Sometimes you have the Australian, which is a paper for my country, Australia. It obviously exists at differing levels, but all of them are closer to the individual than international. Obviously, like Obviously, the Sydney Morning Herald is further than the North Shore Times to me, but on the comparative, both are significantly closer than the international paper. So that scales the degree of difference, but doesn't meaningfully help one of the teams. But the final thing I want to note is that it stops us importing really bad political ideas and having political ideas from other jurisdictions put onto our politics in a way that is deeply unhelpful. That looks like how, because of the dominance of US media in Australia, we view the struggle of Indigenous Australians and African Americans as having a lot in common, even though they're very different problems. They require different solutions. But the problem is that our political discourse is so taken up with Americanization that so many of those ideas are imported when they do not work. Second argument, here's why we actually get more international news, better international news. The first thing to establish is that on both sides, there is likely to be some desire for international news. The question is just who presents it, the international paper or the local paper. Why is this true? First, people care about it. Secondly, it's often exciting. We're talking about wars, we're talking about politics that people care about. Third, people want to seem well informed. There's always likely to be a desire for international news. How do you get access to that international news on our side? First is articles get syndicated, so you publish, the New York Times publish this to get that information. Or secondly, you just access that newspaper directly, right? You will go to Google and Google, like the Brazilian newspaper that provides this information, and then Google translate it over so that you can read it directly. So the question is, where does that international news get originally made? Because on their side, where international papers have all of the resources, the international papers are making the international news. On our side, it's more likely to be the original reporting done in the local newspaper and then seen globally. Why is this likely to be provided by local sources? First, they're able to exist on our side because we have enough demand driven by the fact. And secondly, because people can simply go there directly. Why is this likely to be better? Three reasons. First, these papers are more knowledgeable about their local events. Secondly, they're more on the ground, so more able to do the things that I discussed before, things like going to the protests, going to the Prime Minister's house. But thirdly, they view the things happening in their own country as important in and of themselves. So when there is a coup in a small country, that is covered that the original coverage of that is done by a paper in that country who views that coup as important in and of itself and then is disseminated, rather than the New York Times doing the original reporting, who view that coup not as important in and of itself, but that coup as important in how it affects US interests. So we get better coverage because things are covered as if they are important in and of themselves because we care about people who live in poor countries rather than just through how it affects our Western interests. Final argument, why is it that we get less soft power through bad actors? Why is this largely big, powerful countries whose newspapers and media are likely to predominate? First, I'd note that this is empirically true. Things like the BBC, things like the New York Times. Secondly, they're the biggest papers because they exist in the biggest markets and therefore they're able to take advantage of their resources to spread further. Thirdly, these big countries often engage in colonialism and exported media consumption habits with them. Fourth, they're often considered big and important. The reason that people read the New York Times is because they consider American politics to be big and important, which gives them that advantage. And fifth, big countries often directly fund these papers in order to allow them to spread their message. Things like Al Jazeera being funded by the Qataris. What is the harms of this spread of this soft power? First, they're able to set the global agenda and insulate themselves from accountability. They're able to make the arguments that the war crimes that we committed weren't that bad. They're able to shift the narrative to say that this is what we ought to be focusing on. Secondly, they often spread deeply racist ideas of racial superiority, and obviously this is done implicitly, but it's still a large harm for those groups who are discriminated against, and for those groups who feel attacked and often internalize those ideas, and for the people of the majority group who internalize those ideas as well. And they also use it to spread information that is favorable to their country. The benefits of US capital and why you won't let it in by privatizing your state-owned assets, we stop that sort of soft power from having as much of an influence.
I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for those fine remarks, and I would now like to welcome up the Leader of the Opposition.
I'm audible? Cool. Starting in 3, 2, 1. 2 points in my speech. Firstly, on international news reports that we are going to lose and not be exposed to and why they're super important. Secondly, on impartial reporting of local news and why we want to hear other people's perspectives on what's happening in our own countries. Before that bit of framing and external rebuttal, one big piece of framing, which is important. Note, the biggest issues on both sides will be probably reported on both types of media. That is, as an Israeli, I didn't really need Israeli newspapers to know that my country is at war because every fucking newspaper is currently reporting it everywhere in the world. So I think the likeliest difference is in in the smaller issues on both sides, right? Domestic issues that are very big, like your country's election, going into war, or big things in the economy will be reported on international news media as well. But the smaller things about, you know, your small changes to trade or your local farmers and how they are impacted by this might be reported less. Similarly, we think that what is going to be lost on government side from our world is they probably still report the way that the biggest affairs impact locally. So they would still report on the war in Ukraine in the sense that it impacts your gas prices, or the fact that it impacts in the US government intervening directly in aiding Ukraine, but they would not report as much direct scenes from within Ukraine. They would not report as much things that do not directly impact, or things like the like genocide in Ethiopia that does not have international impact on other countries, but only local impact. Awesome. Secondly, just quick rebuttal. One, people will be exposed to international media anyway and attempt to symmetricize the entirety of opposition because they can just Google translate it. Okay, gut check. Who of you ever did it to any news source in the world ever? This is just not something that happens, partially because people are not that laborious and rigorous in how they consume the news and they don't care enough, but also because language translation apps are just not good enough and high quality enough for us to do this. Secondly, on the idea that language barrier is the reason why most people don't get exposure to significantly foreign media anyway, this is false for a very simple reason. One, the language that most of the internationalized media sources happen in is English, let's be real. And two, when it happens in English, what crucially happens, and OG would know had they not been a monolingual EPL team, is that almost every newspaper in the world has translations of international articles in English. So if there's going to be a New York Times report about Israel, a local newspaper, if it's very important, is likely to translate it to Hebrew. The vice versa effect doesn't happen because everyone in the world knows English and wants to translate it, and these newspapers have a lot of exposure, but not everyone knows Hebrew and not everyone reads our local newspapers. Awesome. With that being said, let's get into the cases. Firstly, on why we need exposure to international events. I want to start by observing that this is false from OG to claim that you have no reason to know about things that happen in the world because they don't impact you. There are at least 3 separate reasons for why it is important for you to know. One, because you do have impact on what happens in other countries. Just indirect aid in forms of charity. If like a lot of people donated to victims and humanitarian aid in Ukraine because they cared and were caring about this because they heard the reports and heard the personal story. But two, because the way your own government operates often impacts other governments, because governments have diplomacy efforts, international affairs, and so on. They impact pressure and sanctions on other countries. They give aid to other countries. And this is a way in which you impact. Second reason, independent of this, is we have a lot to learn from other countries' models and mistakes. What does this mean? That, for example, if Israel had a judicial overhaul, I would have known much more about it had I been exposed to more reporting on the judicial overhaul that happened previously in Poland. Because sure, it doesn't directly impact my government. So at the time, before it became relevant, there was no reason to report it. But now I could have known what it leads to. Similarly, we think that a lot of the processes of populism that are currently happening in the US have already happened in many countries in Europe in the second half of the 20th century, and Americans would understand it much better had they been more aware of what's happening in the world around them. But the third reason why you should care about what happens in other countries is because stuff that don't directly impact you yet might impact you in the future. Note, sure, the war in Ukraine, once it happened, would have been reported anyway. But you know what was reported in international media and not in local media years ago? The chances of a war in Ukraine. Because aggressions from Russia on the border of Ukraine were there for years, but before it became an all-out war of aggression that impacted the global economy and everything else, no one cared outside of these countries, and this is why people didn't expect what was obviously going to come for them. The elections that happened in Israel ended up impacting the war in Palestine, but people didn't care until it became an all-out war. You would have been much more prepared for it had these things been exposed in advance. We think that on government's world, you're exposed to these things significantly less. One, because you only hear of them once they become influential on you and never in advance. Two, because you don't hear from them at all if they don't directly impact you. And three, because even when they are reported less, and the emphasis that is put on them is much more biased. So this means that when you have reportings on the war on drugs in Latin America in the US, you would not hear so much about the impacts of the war on drugs on Latin Americans, but only the impacts it has on importation of drugs into the US. It means that when you read about warfare in other countries, you will read much more how it impacts your economy or your policy, but will not hear at all about the humanitarian crisis going on and how you need to be involved in them. Before I move on, closing extension. Opening.
This is a risk, but I'll have a punt. Let's test your theory that important events in your country will always be covered in international papers. Maybe true for Israel. Question: do you know who the newly elected Prime Minister of New Zealand is?
No, but I think insofar as this is a newly elected prime minister, you would have heard about it anyway, regardless. One, because I think some people are reading more than me about international affairs, especially if you're in New Zealand. The parts of The Economist you would read would be much more on Oceania articles. I am more interested in reading about, I guess, European affairs and Asian affairs because they directly impact me, but you can always read on Oceania affairs also on Economist and BBC. But two, because I think you will hear about it from other people in your country because it will be all over the place in social media. There would be campaigning and propaganda. You don't need just the news for it. Awesome. Let's talk about quality of reporting and bias. Look, at least 3 separate reasons for why we think quality of reporting, even on local affairs, is better on your side, on our side. One, just because we have much better funding. All right, this is something considered by OG. These newspapers have much more buy-in. They are international. They have an international audience. This gives them more resources. These resources allow them to do things like better research, like send the reporters into a scene with defenses and getting reporting from inside, like being able to fact check better because they can pay external fact checkers. Two, it just means that there's much more scrutiny because when there are much more eyes on the newspaper, a lot more people will notice if there's a mistake in the New York Times or if there's false reporting and will flag it because there are much more readers. But three, because there's much less bias because we think local journals appeal and pander to local populations and the local population's biases because they are often attached to funding by local groups that are directly involved and because the journalists themselves often have much more direct biases as a result of living in the country, which means that they would report in a much more partial manner. We get better reporting even on local issues on our side. Beg you to oppose.
I'd like to thank that speaker for those fine remarks, and I would now like to welcome up the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Hey, just checking I'm audible. Lovely. Opening opposition is playing a kind of sneaky double game because they say on our side people are kind of reading the bad kind of local news, whereas on their side, as soon as people suddenly start reading these international papers, they're suddenly the best sort of matter filer on the planet, right? Where they're for some reason, rather than doing what every person does, which is follow the years of speculation about the American presidential race, which contributes fuck all to your understanding of the world, instead they're reading about genocides in depth in Ethiopia, or they're reading about judicial reforms. The vast majority of this international reporting is just whatever is most flashy. So if they say this local stuff isn't great, I don't think they get their fantastic in-depth understanding of anything either. So let's start by talking about domestic news. And we would note that this is by far the most important issue on 2 grounds. First of all, domestic issues are by far the most important issues. You know, they say these are kind of small issues, but like even the Australian, like a federal election got 0 coverage in like The Economist or wherever else. But it's like, these are things like corruption or holding local police to account, things like understanding local economic conditions and whatever. And sure, these might sound small if you're considering an individual jurisdiction, but multiply it by every jurisdiction, it is really important. And the way you can tell that it's more important than international affairs is if you think about all of the portfolios a government has, one of them is about international affairs, all of the others are about domestic affairs. So probably the domestic affairs are more important. But second of all, domestic affairs are far more in control of the people because foreign policy is almost always bipartisan, because it's influenced by the exact same set of think tanks, because it doesn't affect the local people of that country directly, but also because you know, the parties sort of have to agree on everything because usually a government makes a promise that then the next government has to keep up. And so there ends up, it basically isn't a voting issue. So even if everyone on their side is mega informed about international affairs, it's unlikely that it's actually going to lead to that much significant change because foreign relations are largely outside of the control of people. So why is it that domestic news is far better on our side? First of all, they know far more about the area, they're connected to local sources, and they're trusted by local sources. Second of all, they care a lot more. They grew up there, they're not going to leave. This is what really matters to them. They're not just looking for the next best paid job, they're trying to do the best. And this is important because this means that there are issues on our side that are covered that aren't covered on their side. Because on their side, local newspapers are failing, which means that, for instance, police departments are able to get away with far worse. But also, they're not distracted from these sort of far-off stories from the things that really matter to them in a local. Opening opposition gives 3 reasons why domestic news is worse than sort of big stuff. They say the first thing is about funding, but the thing is they say you can get fact checkers, but if you've already got the people on the ground who have the facts, fact checking is kind of less important. Also, they don't seem to do much fact checking if you look at, for instance, the lead up to the Iraq War. Or the other thing is they say, well, if you've got funding, you can send people into places, but these people are already in those places. Problem solved. The second thing is they say international ones are under more scrutiny, but often this is scrutiny of the bad sort, where it means, for instance, they're highly susceptible to political backlash, but also it's unclear. Yeah, so it's unclear why scrutiny actually does that sort of stuff. Also, for instance, like small ones can be under local scrutiny, and thus that can also hold them to account. That seems kind of symmetric. And even if it's not symmetric, it's symmetric in another way. The third thing they say is they're not impartial because they pander to locals. But insofar as any media organization has a base of readers, they're probably pandering to those readers, right? Like there's nothing not symmetric in this response. But also we would note that if you want something impartial, like there are many in one particular region, so people can pick the ones that are actually the most informative. So even if there's a lot of censorship in China, for instance, you can get good China regional news through, for instance, reading the South China Morning Post. So here's the thing. At the end of this, you can see that on opposition, you are unable to understand basic information and hold people who actually hold the most power, the people that build the infrastructure, that run the schools, that run the hospitals. That's what matters, because sure, flashy things in international relations might seem important, but they're outside of people's control. And if you actually run the numbers, by far the most important things are the running of local things all over the world, which we get far better. I'll take closing.
I think that people just often don't care. It's uninteresting who's running for office in New Jersey because, sure, like their decision making is kind of relevant to me, but it's really,
Right.
really.
No, okay, so the thing is, people sort of want to be informed. And so the thing is, if they're not getting their fill from the big international name brand newspapers, they're probably going to look to local things. But also local things might be a bit boring. But if it's your particular area, that is really important because it's the school that your kids attend. It's the hospital that you might have to go to, or that, for instance, your grandparents died in. Like these are things that matter to you. So even if they're a little bit unflashy, for instance, local corruption scandals are things that are really important. Local news was a flourishing thing throughout the majority of the 20th century until economies of scale of the really big newspapers pushed them out of business. That's what we regret. They were able to support themselves because people were actually interested. Finally, on international news, we would note 2 independent ways in which we win. First off, we noted that it is probably better off if people literally don't know anything about what happens outside of their countries, basically because these large-scale media organizations, more often than not, just serve as a tool of the powerful, be that the soft power of the USA, or for instance, the think tanks that basically just publish their op-eds in it. I think you would probably be more informed about the Iraq War if you had never opened up the New York Times than if you actually read it religiously every single day. That is, they serve to misinform because they serve the interests of the powerful. The second thing, though, is that you get far better international news on our side because you get that through local news. And because, for instance, you can seek out local or regional news from other regions. They say no one does this because this takes a bit of effort. But insofar as there is appetite for information, people are likely to seek this out to a reasonable degree. The other thing they say is about language barriers. But first of all, translation technology is improving and is pretty good. Sure, you might not be able to translate some random township, but if it's like the big newspaper of Brazil, probably they're publishing in other languages, not just like Portuguese and English, but also insofar, like we pointed to the mechanism of syndication, which is where your regional newspaper will get another regional newspaper story and translate it into your language. So there will be the translation infrastructure. It's just translating one thing, not too hard. It gets done anyway. So now to respond directly to the other things they say, first of all, international stuff directly affects you. First of all, I think we need to be comparative. Insofar as it affects your region, your regional newspaper is probably going to report on it, right? Like that seems kind of obvious. And even if it's slightly worse than otherwise, pretty minor compared to all of the other things at play in this debate. So you actually get support on that. The second thing they say is you can learn from what other states do. First of all, we can do that. For instance, an Australian newspaper can say, we should copy the drug policy that Portugal does, but that's probably more relevant and better insofar as it's designed to be applied to your situation rather than leaving you to fill in the gaps. The second thing is often this just serves to mislead because countries are more different than they are similar. At the end of this, domestic news is what matters. We deliver on that. We also win the other issue. That seems pretty clear for opening up.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for his fine remarks, and now welcome up the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Here.
Am I audible? Awesome. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think OO win in 2 simple ways. We show you why you need international exposure to content you wouldn't have access to otherwise because it affects you and you have no alternatives. And second, why the quality of exposure you're getting to content, both local and international, is actually going to be significantly higher. Let's talk about exposure to international context and reporting. The reasons we get why this will still happen is syndication, and people will just print what happens in other places. But we think that there's not that much interest and it's drowned out when you're constantly being shown things that are in the next county over that may or may not also affect your county to some degree. There is no political interest in giving you access to that because political people want you to focus on what's happening here and stuff they can affect and not have that. And people just actively care less. While it's true that as long as there's an appetite for information, people will seek it out. But I think that most people have an appetite for having any information. They don't know the exact information they care about, and they depend on news sources to tell them what's important and relevant to them, which means that they won't actively go and Google Translate and search for things happening if they perceive of them as far away. They will look at the news to tell them what they need to know, and therefore they're less likely to go looking for it. Notice that this already means that they're less likely to be exposed to things internationally than locally, because people do have a bias to care and understand things that affect them that are close by, but they don't understand how things that are further away from them might affect them and might be relevant to them. And they need that to be fed to them, because if anyone is going to go looking for any information, it's information that is directly applicable to them. Why then do we think that exposure to this content is more important than exposure to local content? We think that several things. First of all, we think that the things that are happening abroad in terms of soft power, in terms of impacting reporting and political views, already impact the reporting and the politics that happen within your country, whether you're exposed to it or not exposed to it. Politicians talk to other politicians. Businesses talk to other businesses, and things that are happening in other countries are affecting your country in ways that are invisible or you might not know or understand about and are less salient than the local election and things like that. We think that in a world where you're constantly bombarded with information, awareness of different perspectives and awareness of the different things that are impacting and might be the people who are affecting you's interests is important. So I don't know if my prime minister is having a conference with people abroad, or even if 2 countries that aren't my country are having a conference and the results of that conference might affect the political landscape of my country. I want to know that in advance because it might impact the way that my politicians are presenting the narrative to me now. If I'm not aware of these things, I can't inform myself and I can't think critically about what the possible interests might be. Second, we just think that understanding and awareness of different perspectives that I'm not exposed to, whether it's values-based or anything else-based, is important for me to reach the right conclusion. OG tell us on this that we're going to import bad political views. But you know what? Maybe those political views and maybe those values are important and are actually good. We don't think that people automatically import political views. We think that we are exposed to political views, have local discussions about it. Politicians campaign about things. Things are discussed with my friends, with my family, online and social media with different perspectives. We think that that local discussion and understanding what is relevant for us and irrelevant for us is important for people to reach the best conclusions about what they want, but they can't do that when they don't have access to those views in the first place. So we think that commentary, discourse, and critique will happen locally anyways, but they won't happen at all if I'm not exposed to those things and I don't know anything about them. So we think that in those terms, it's better to be exposed. Second, we think that we are likely to be exposed to local issues anyways, even if it's not from local news sources. Because I have friends and acquaintances who are affected, because they talk about it on social media and they make sure that I'm aware, because politicians are going to be campaigning on the radio and on TV and in commercials, regardless of whether it's in the news source specifically, because I might be personally affected, or just because people care a lot about it. Notice that this is especially true with OG's weird framing of, I'm mainly going to access international sources that are exactly far enough away from me to not have new information for me, but are close enough to me so that they're still, I don't know, it means they're still likely to cover things like politics and economics, because my local politics affect the things that are regional to me, and my economics affects the people who have trade agreements and immigration with me, which means that as long as it's probably going to be regional and people we perceive as speaking the same language and same area, that's still going to be covered, but from an international perspective. And lastly, we think it does inform locally, even if it's harder for me to understand that, which is why the context for why I should care about it and the importance is important that I get it internationally, because I don't have that context otherwise for me. Because these things not only might happen in my country, but might affect my country, but also I might be exposed to new perspectives that shed new light on how I view my own life. If I'm exposed to the fact that in France there is a militaristic, basically, separation of church and state, then that's different from my country, and I read about why that is, and coverage encourages discussion, it might change my perspective on the position of church and state in my country and what I believe about it, and expose me to things that I might care about morally in the rest of the world. If people are dying of famine in Yemen, that's not less important than the things happening around me. I just have a bias to care less, and I won't be informed about them and won't know to take steps to donate from my own money or to push my own politicians to do things about things like human aid or intervening in other countries if I don't know about those things happening. So we think that that exposure, the critical thinking that comes from it, and the better understanding of, yes, my own political landscape reaches the conclusion that we actually want and is more important. I'll take closing if you have anything.
Is news reportage more likely to be biased when it is made for profit or not for profit?
I think all media coverage that is resilient in the long term is for profit, whether it's people locally paying, like everyone is going to pay for it. Otherwise, you have no way of funding things. So that's what I think. And that, especially, I think that it is less likely to be biased if the funding it gets and if its readerships are as diverse as possible and represent as diverse political landscape as possible, meaning you're not dependent on one group of people. Notice that we think that that is also what affects quality of the same thing that are covered as well, because we think that local newspapers, there isn't often one local newspaper that's covering your own things. We think that often local newspapers tend to be very partisan, tend to pander to a very specific readership and viewership, and they're therefore only held accountable by those politicians and that viewership. We think that international newspapers, have both the funding to cover things and research things deeply into both directions, but second, are held accountable to both sides of the political spectrum, meaning they can't afford to lean one way or the other, and their readers tend to be significantly more diverse, meaning they're held accountable by more people. We think that means that it's local and quality coverage for local stuff too. For those reasons, oppose.
I'd like to thank that speaker for those fine remarks and thank all of the teams in the opening half of the debate. To open the closing half of the debate, I'd like to welcome up the member for the government. Here.
Hello, am I audible? Yes, no? Oh, thanks. Closing government's extension in this debate is not going to be particularly glamorous, but it will make what I think at this point is a bit of a punter observation. The main actor that creates news that is directed at local or national issues is governments through public service broadcasters like the ABC or the BBC. But observing this is, I think, actually an enormous boon for the government bench in this debate, because what governments do when they fund public service broadcasters is they provide free access to media to a vast majority of people. Because unlike what you hear from that deputy leader of the opposition speech, government funding for government public service broadcasters is actually far more resilient to market shocks because the source of funding is tax, which is far more reliable than who is desiring your media. And also, these medias have less incentives to deliver biased, clickbaity reporting that is actually irrelevant to people that can't be actioned because they have more of an incentive. They're often codified directly by governments to deliver information of actionable pertinence to people who read them, all of which is good, all of which overcomes symmetry problems in the opening half. Let's see which public service broadcasters can characterize them. These are bodies like ABC News in Australia, like BBC News in Britain, that are funded by governments for the purpose of reporting on national events. And obviously they syndicate out more locally. I'll talk in a moment about how they do international reporting, but they obviously do some of that, but clearly their focus is on national-based events. And the motivation to create these bodies is public desire for accountability over a private media market, for a more trustworthy form of communication that they can receive, for instance, about crises, for instance, about things where government messaging might be of high pertinence, like should you wear a mask? What's the evidence behind that? And where governments want a direct method to ensure their policies or messages are reported and people will ultimately see them. Categorically, these are defined with a national focus in mind, which overcomes like perhaps an uncharitable rebuttal, which is like, well, Al Jazeera is an international body, but it's funded by Qatar. Like clearly, we're talking about bodies that have a primary focus on national, and we support their national wings, but also they do like reporting on international affairs as well. But when these bodies, public service broadcasters do this, they have an emphasis on how that country's policies do affect international events rather than just what the international event is itself. So for instance, for me, an important question as an Australian voter thinking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is my government funding weapons to Israel or to Hamas? Is Australia giving humanitarian aid to people in the Gaza Strip? Those are questions that would decide my vote. But you know, if I was going to an international news outlet, I probably wouldn't be able to like get that level of granular detail. Those are things that actually matter to me. So creating international reporting to focus on things that voters can actually impact with their own lives is something that means people engage with media because they feel it's meaningful and it's directed at things they have a direct capacity to change, but also avoid the opening heart problems of you being fire hosed with information that may indeed be irrelevant to you. Now, obviously, I can hear off-bench writing their rebuttal already. Many public service broadcasters whitewash government abuses. No, these cases are symmetric. Don't make this rebuttal. Western liberal democracies are virtually the only place where this like sort of has some symmetry. Like autocratic governments that set up medias to control the flow of information. There's virtually no comparative because they don't let international media outlets in. They restrict reporter access. They disallow entrance to their markets. So it's not really meaningful to prefer it in these contexts. We prefer where these public service broadcasters exist and compete with private and domestic and international bodies. And we suggest they do compete, and they often successfully outcompete because they're seen as trustworthy, because they have a lot of money with a reliable source, tax, to publish a lot, and they have inside access to government actions. And so I would suggest this mostly exists in contexts where there is meaningful competition in the media market, i.e. mostly Western liberal democracies, where these public service broadcasters are accompanied by charters of government non-interference, they are substantially independent, and they are well-resourced by virtue of laws that make them well-resourced. And I would suggest these bodies are awesome, but let's take OO before I get into that.
Almost every single piece of coverage about the Ukraine war was about aid and which countries are supporting Ukraine or not supporting Ukraine, as well as politicians making it actively part of their campaigning because these are actions they are taking. Once again, insofar as international media is relevant to what's happening in your country, you're likely to hear about it locally, even from international sources.
The thing that matters to me is only how my government affects, because that's the only thing that I can change. Like being fire hosing me with information about how like the United Kingdom or the US or Israel is impacting the Ukrainian conflict is entirely irrelevant to me as a voter. Clearly you prefer the thing that actually gives you the granular detail about that you think you can affect. These things are good. Unlike any actor in the market, you are insulated from market forces. You're not created to run a profit. Your main reason to be is to report on your affairs of your country. The funding is guaranteed by taxpayers, which means you can do things like have less disingenuous and clickbaity reporting, which means the poor understanding of events, which we suggest is worse than having no understanding because you vote badly and you get polarized against opinions you ought not, does not happen because there is no incentive for governments to do clickbaity reporting. They don't need people to buy a subscription. They don't need for tax benefits, for instance, to people to click their articles, so they're able to do reporting that is less biased and more information providing. But also, they're capable of reporting on things that matter to less profitable actors and groups, issues that affect smaller communities. For instance, Indigenous communities in Western New South Wales would go underreported by anyone if there weren't a charter by the government that said groups that there is no market profitable incentive to cater to should be reported on because those things matter. The only actors that are capable of performing that kind of reporting are actors who do have massive incentives to appeal to an entire population of people, including the most vulnerable minorities that in their own right might not be able to sustain reporting that might be necessary. But also, they're not owned by monopolistic or oligopolistic media moguls, which means they are far more accountable because, you know, in some meaningful sense, they're like what appeals to a vocal marketable minority doesn't define what your body does. So you can change the reporting a lot more. You can keep that far more accountable. But also, the desire to exert bias on reporting is often a desire by private corporations to differentiate themselves from other private actors in the market. For instance, this is why you get right-wing medias like The Economist that cater to that set of preferences, or left-wing bodies like The Guardian that seek to capitalistically appeal to a certain market. Governments, by virtue of having to appeal to a very broad incentive, have absolutely less need to do that distinguishing. But also, they're made free to access, unlike private media, which relies on you having to be behind a paywall in order to purchase it, which means it is used by far more people and people who matter who are unable to afford other kinds of media. This is a good because the benefits of media are to some extent generic, like having access to information about a crisis that might affect you and you might have the ability to change, clearly something that can be captured by both sides, but only something in our world that can be captured by poorer people in a world in which governments do news reporting. But also, I think this is just a principle and practical good. And I think this implicitly reveals that many of the questions that float in this opening half about what is good info, what is like reliable and biased information, is resolved by observing that mostly this is done by governments, and governments are far preferable.
I'd like to thank that speaker for those fine remarks, and I would now like to welcome up the member for the opposition. Here.
Actually, no, it's yours.
Yeah,
Well, okay.
because
Do you want to see it?
no.
Okay. So much anger in your voice. Got it. Okay. Unlike CG, I will do what I think will prove to be an actually simple claim in this debate, which is to show that international media is required to get accountability measures that all teams have attempted at some level to assert, but nobody is actually properly engaged with. Before I get into the extension then on why you need international news for accountability, I'll provide three brief responses, two to OG and one to CG. First of all, OG, very, very nitpicky in the way that they approach examples in this round. It is not true that The Economist didn't cover the Australian election, for example. Like, it is so deeply tied to the growth of populism in the United States that it was so easy for a news article, like for a news agency like The Economist, to push this very heavily. But second of all, they talk about capacity as though like capacity doesn't exist in some relevant way for international news sources. Think about this. They say you need to be in the room. No, this is the age of Zoom. You don't need to be in the room. Second, you need to be on the ground. Okay, hire a freelancer, which you already do, or fly someone out with your big budget, which you already do. All of these capacity issues are overcome. It is irrelevant. The CG case, I think, is incredibly weird. It feels very, very small because I just don't think it's true that the vast majority of countries operate by funding their own media organizations because, like, gee, spend the money on healthcare or something. Like, their case is basically, we don't like the private monopoly where there is at least competition. What we want is the government monopoly where there is one party and there is just like loads and loads of political bias that can infect this. I am not sure why this is even a case that like made sense to you in prep. Okay, first argument that, or sole argument on why accountability requires international news. OG says you can only hold people to be accountable when you're local, as though like Alberto Fujimori didn't buy out every single news channel in Peru in order to overcome this very, very simple accountability check. But second, OO says you can do more research and have more funding as an international news source. This is true, but it's very generic, and it's unclear why the additional levels of quality that you get from international news is good. Why does this mean, and this is what we'll prove, why does this mean that big stories like Snowden leaks, for example, get run by the Washington Post and Guardian uniquely, things that affect loads and loads of people, things that initiate conversations on things like whether or not governments should be surveilling us around the world? These things require international media. Here are two things that international media has that local news sources do not. First of all, they have controversy tolerance. That is to say that because you have big budgets to be able to do things like engage in lawsuits and protect journalists who do things like expose classified information that might put them up at risk of like being charged with something like treason, the Washington Post is uniquely able to do things like present Snowden leaks or to be able to disclose classified information about Vietnam that the US government was literally asking them not to do. There's a literal Meryl Streep movie about this entire thing, and that is because international news organizations are so powerful. Compare this to smaller organizations that cannot protect their journalists, though, that cannot provide them with the guarantee of safety. They are much less likely to have those journalists volunteer themselves to put them in a position where they, themselves, their career, their family could be threatened by controversial stories that they post. When the Baltimore Sun tried to run a story about thin thread surveillance in the United States, the result was that the journalist who wrote it went underground because she couldn't protect herself from persistent attacks from the US government to try and shut her up and to try and prevent the story from spreading. The second thing is you get clout as an international news organization, so you get access to things like interviews. When you turn down as a politician an interview from the New York Times, it looks like you're hiding. When you turn down an interview from a municipal organization, it looks like you simply don't have time for small budget news sources. This is the difference, and this is why you have more power as these organizations. The impact then of these stories is twofold. One, you massively impact people's understandings of issues. And the reason is there is much stronger targeting of rich people in our world. Now, there is a factual misnomer that we get from OG, which is like the rich control this. This is like the most Trumpist line I've ever heard in a debate, and I don't think it's true. The reason is you have literally much stronger levels of deterrence against rich people. You have individuals who own, for example, multinational corporations, whose corporations are now exposed not just to that municipality where they've been polluting, but to the entire world over. It's not just Indonesia that hears about the fact that palm oil pollution or deforestation is affecting Indonesia. It's the entire world. It's the New York Times telling you that you should boycott this company, and that has international ramifications exclusively because of the scope of the audience that they can access by themselves. The second thing is, I just think it is much easier empirically to control local news sources if you do have money, because you can buy journalists off. Like at the very worst, like you can try and buy these organizations as well. Like Jared Kushner did this with local news in New York because it's just smaller. Like you can own it if you have a bit of money. It's much harder to do that with like the New York Times. But third, people change when they do engage with this media. You trust international news a lot more. And this is true especially in corrupt places. You believe that it is likely to be true in a way that you don't believe of your local news sources. But second, you consume when you're vulnerable, when you're tired, when you're waking up from bed, for example, and you flip through the paper. This means that it allows you to inculcate values of things like a belief that democracy should be universal, for example. These type of things can only access you when you are engaging with media that you trust and that is universal and talks about these things. But second, when we do get stories about corruption, we can uniquely access low-income areas and people that are important in small communities that the rest of the debate cannot. OG, go ahead.
When necessary, small organizations work together to form syndicates to, for instance, process documents or cover each other's backs, as happened with the Paradise Panama Papers.
Okay, so your idea is like, we need huge levels of coordination. Like we need everyone to agree. We need every single journalist along the way to say like, you know what, I'm going to put myself at risk. Here's a novel idea. Just use the backing that you already have at this one news source that says, yeah, we're game for it, rather than need to deal with coordination as the basis for whether or not you actually publish a story in the first place. All this POI does, by the way, is acknowledge that there is a huge cost that journalists are terrified of, and you need coordination to be able to do anything, which you prove at no point in that speech is at all likely. Okay, Three reasons why you can access lower income and lower access areas. One, everywhere where there is internet, international news is better. And the reason is that infrastructure for things like website development and maintenance and spread is very, very expensive. International media is much more likely to be able to bite the bullet on that. Second, you adopt things like variable pricing schemes to account for this. Corporations want to price discriminate to be able to access as many people as possible. There are different equilibrium prices between supply and demand in different regions where people have more or less money. What that means is that you set a price that is accessible to people in areas that might not be true of the United States, for example. So when you're giving news sources to like Ghana, it's just cheaper. It makes sense, right? This is very intuitive. But third, you are more likely to run branches in local areas, which the New York Times and Washington Post empirically do. Like they do have local like branches in other areas around the world, but you're much more likely to do that in places that otherwise don't get local coverage because there's a perception that your mission is to provide transparency and information. So you're willing to do things like run at a loss. We get access for these places. We get the corruption stories that are so important to people's lives. And for this reason, the most important things depend on the CO case. We oppose.
I'd like to thank that speaker for those fine remarks, and I would now like to welcome up the government whip. Here.
Oh, I assume I'm audible. I don't know why I still say that. Like, it would be really awkward if Oscar wasn't. Okay, cool. I'm going to start my speech now. PBS, NPR, SBS, ABC, Televisión Pública Argentina, and Presa Brazil, the Thai Public Broadcasting Service, DD National India. These are the public service broadcasters CO just tried to tell you did not exist. They are the primary source of news for millions of people around the world. The idea that our extension is at all marginal is absolutely uncharitable and baffling, and quite frankly deserved a much better response before op-whip, which is the last speech in the debate. I'm going to first defend our extension, remind you why it is categorically important, overcomes the kind of, I guess, trifling claims made by other teams, and then go through each team individually. What do we tell you? We tell you that public service broadcasters are excellent. They are firstly not subject to market fluctuation and biases, driven by a desire to create profit, which means they do not create clickbaiting news because they are not, driven by clicks to get ads, for example. They do not have the bias that international organizations necessarily do, because by the reason that OO tells you in response to a POI, their readerships are spread out around the globe, which means the way that you get attention is by being particularly partisan. We tell you that they are, provide a form of accountability for a private market, that they are categorically free to access for citizens, not only within the countries that produce them, but usually around the world. And fourthly, they are usually charter bound to service all of their citizens, to create, for example, content for everyone in their country, not just the ones who are in the metropolitan areas that are able to offer them money, because, for example, they are funded by taxpayers, because they have democratic incentives not to get funded by pissing off the government. I suggest to you all weigh this incredibly highly. This overcomes the kind of back and forth present throughout the rest of the debate, which is about which kind of news is better to consume. We point to a model of news which exclusively exists under our side when you have nationally driven or nationally focused news, which PSBs categorically are. What responses do we get? The first, as I've already flagged in my introduction, is that they do not exist. A structural reason beyond all of the examples that I've given you, and that the OIB knows because they categorically probably read one of these papers, is that there is just a democratic demand for public service media. People want to read stuff that is not created by a private market. They want free access to media. Rural Australians, for example, want radio in their town, and Murdoch is never going to cover that. The other response we get is that PSBs are particularly biased. I know the framing Oscar brings you, which is woefully responded to, because in contexts where governments have significant overreach to the extent that their PSBs are particularly biased, access to international news is also incredibly low. It's likely that the public service broadcasters which do exist, that are, a model, like a paradigm we are focusing on in this debate, are ones which are created in Western liberal democracies. And we'd argue that they're not biased for three reasons. Firstly, empirically, the ABC in Australia reported on war crimes committed by the Australian military. They are often very good at holding the government accountable. Secondly, they are distinct from partisan bodies. They are not, for example, a Republican or a Democrat-led public service broadcaster. They are funded by taxpayers, and therefore they are not partisan. It's so unclear they would be biased either way. But thirdly, there is the fact that if they were defunded by a particular government, there would be democratic backlash, because obviously if, for example, the Liberals decide to defund the ABC, people would be like, holy shit, they're trying to censor the ABC, meaning that they are unlikely to be defunded by either party, which means they are insulated from that potential threat that could influence the way that they report. Let's talk about CO's case. One observation, all of the mechanisms they give you about how their bigger corporations are insulated against controversy, about how they have clout, etc., rely on two things, and that is the size of these organizations and the reputation that they have. I think both of these metrics are vulnerable to the actual counterfactual in this debate, which are not tiny little, local newspapers that are tossed on doorsteps every morning, but they are government-run organizations. Places like the BBC, for example, which are funded by the UK government, which have an awful amount of capital, an awful amount of reputation, where it would be incredibly damning if you were to turn down an interview from them, for example, who are able to insulate themselves against controversy. And the second observation I would make is that I think the size and reputation and the profit dependency of these international organizations like the New York Times, for example, could easily be flipped or co-opted, I should say, because it makes that is more likely to make them risk averse in the sense that they're unlikely to run particularly damaging stories if there is a potential that they might be exposed as being untrue. For example, running stories about alleged war crimes, that is not something that a public service broadcaster has to contend with, because they will not ever have their risk the risk their profit being taken away. They are not reliant on profit. Let's now talk about opening opposition. Their case has two prongs, the first of which is that international awareness or awareness of international events is particularly meaningful. Two responses. The first is that I think they unfairly conflate awareness and empathy. I think it is incredibly speculative to suggest that knowledge of things happening in other countries that translates to the direct effort they try to claim to impact. You ought at least mitigate that, if not to totally take it off of their tally. The second thing they say is that, the second observation I would make is that these international publications that they're defending are categorically for profit or agenda driven. Look at the way that Rupert Murdoch, for example, reports on foreign policy. They are unaccountable in the way that PSBs are, which means that insofar as they do raise awareness, that is directed towards a certain agenda. Weigh their contribution in this sense here. I think it is incredibly speculative that you get more empathy. Compare that to the structure which we can defend of a particularly good model of news provision. The second claim they make is that local news can be nationalistic. I would note that it is often not, for the reasons I already gave you as to why they're not biased. The second thing to say is that obviously nationalistic biases prevail otherwise. For example, government censor things. You talk to people around you. It's unclear that nationalism is uniquely fostered by local news. And the last thing to say is, because in response to the POI that I asked, obviously international news can be partisan, because the way they appeal to readers is by appealing to a particular political perspective. That means that you're more likely to get particular perspectives amplified and put stress upon in these international contexts than ones which are not operating by pandering to either side of the political spectrum. I'll take opening.
Showing advantages of either local or international media is non-comparative in a prefers debate. We both weigh and show why our source of information is unique, as well as analyze why actually quality of coverage is more important than access to the most niche types of information in your country.
I think we are the only team that actually contributes a unique, an asymmetric benefit to the debate. We are talking about a model of news funding that is government funding, which only exists under government side. Every other claim about the relative size of these organizations, the incentives that they have, the way that they report is, I think, largely symmetric. We uniquely bring the model of funding, and that is what unlocks all of the benefits we point to. Let's lastly talk about OG. I think they run into the issues that POI and as I've previously identified, of symmetry, which is that I think there is probably incentive to be reporting on the big issues that impact other countries or impact countries around the world. And when you look at the smaller events that impact these communities, I think there is an incentive for that reportage to exist in either side. It's unclear that it is necessarily better or worse than, for example, the Economist Australian chapter reporting on a local news event than it is, the Sydney Morning Herald reporting on that event. We take on the much higher burden, which is about a model of funding exclusive to our side, which cannot be preferred at all under their side of the debate. We tell you ought prefer media that is bipartisan, that is insulated from market shocks, that is free, that is accountable to the people as according to a charter. You ought prefer CG.
Okay, I'd like to thank that speaker for those fine remarks, and now welcome up the opposition whip to close out the debate. Here.
I'll take POIs visually, please. We'll call on OG, so you don't have to worry about keeping your hand up. Yeah. the worst abuses of power in the world happen behind closed doors. The rich and powerful and governments that think they can get away with it use the shadows to hide their behavior. Big international news corporations are crucial because they're the only actors who are big enough to stand toe-to-toe against these actors. What Isaac told you is accountability is possible to hold back this kind of overstepping only when you have resources, only when you're so international that your office isn't based in the same country that you're trying to hold into account. What we're able to do is to punish companies, punish governments that overstep, as well as to deter other actors from doing the same thing, because a factory that has like expose written on it gets brought to court and loses millions of dollars, for example. International organizations like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal compete between one another in order to deliver novel, deep information, which is why they want to go into this kind of depth, and they're willing to pay the money needed to spend months investigating one particular government or one particular state of like corporations breaking human rights laws, for example. This is impossible on the Gov side because you aren't protected by the fact that your reporters are based in the UK, not in like Zambia, for example, and they can just fuck off whenever. You don't have the clout in order to secure a kind of interview or like the rights to investigate a particular mine, and you don't have the ability to unite international viewership that has money, that has connections to their own domestic government in order to change the way in which the biggest and richest countries in the world carry out their foreign policy. I think Isaac's given you a ton of examples, Edward Snowden, etc., about how it is big international companies that had the ability to undergo the risk of undertaking truly risk investigations that expose abuses. This outweighs the material from OO just because I think it connects much better onto actual tangible impacts, because they tell us that you could have higher quality information about how this is really, really like great or objective, or you could hypothetically like investigate in other countries, but like, so what? Like, I guess it's nice that people know, but they never tell us what particular harm they're actually trying to alleviate, whereas Isaac's told you that abuses are interesting. They make people look at the news, and that's why this kind of investigation happens uniquely on our side. I think on the basis of our extension alone, we go through. But I'll, do some more rebuttal as well. What are the responses / other material on the ground that clashes directly against like our extension? From OO, we get the claim that, from OG, no thank you, we get the claim that the problem with international, like Western publications, is that they're captured by power. Like, yes, sure, the New York Times mandate is definitely to publish about and legitimize US war crimes as opposed to criticize these kinds of atrocities. You know who chooses to graduate from university and work for the New York Times? People who are super, super woke and liberal and care about truth and objectivity and are therefore willing to pass up like a really, really well-paying finance / consulting job. They really, really are anti-establishment and want to shed light on these kinds of abuses. Like, who's the rudest with American government? Americans. Okay, so I think there's just like kind of absurd intuition pump. Like, yeah. What we get from CO is better, from CG is better, and they give us this claim that you can have this spotlight from local governments instead, which can have the same effect of accountability, such changing voting patterns, but it's just better because it's like on the ground. Few responses for this. The first thing is like, I think that this doesn't matter if people don't read local news, which is something I'm going to prove to you in a sec. But number two, they try to preempt the reflexive response of like, what government is going to pay for you to criticize them, with a claim that like there's going to be symmetry in autocratic countries, so the only delta isn't democracies. So the problem with this is like the set of countries that are willing to pay for an actually objective news source, because Malaysia is a democracy, for example, but their PM is definitely not paying for absolutely objective criticism of their own regime, overlaps very strongly with with Western global democracies, where everyone's agreed international organizations that also do report on their own countries are based. Like the New York Times is going to do the same thing as the NPR does, for example. But the third thing is just like basic rebuttal. Like number one, like they tell us about how these kinds of organizations actually end up reporting on news across the world. I think that the emotion / info slide talks about reporting that is focused on national / regional issues, which means that at the point at which the BBC devotes 70% of their website to Latin America, like Asia, blah, 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 like this makes them no longer a local kind of news source. But also, like, I just don't think it's the case that these kind of organizations actually select a criticism of their local governments, because even if you aren't jailed for being really, really anti-establishment, you don't get promoted or appointed for stirring shit in this manner either. I don't think that CG really has much to go with. I'll take OG now.
Yeah, regional papers like the LA Times are big enough to break the sorts of stories you talk about, and smaller local ones are idealistic enough to willingly accept the risks. It's the big international ones with profit-hungry shareholders who avoid these risks and don't publish the stories that matter.
Guys, average reasonable voter, have you read the LA Times take on whistleblowers on Afghanistan, for example? Like, absolutely fucking not. The quality is also just much better when you have a really international organization. Like, small news outlets that are idealistic enough to report on these big things. Like, no, they have no capacity to fly someone out there. But number two, if they do, they get fucking shut down. So yeah. Okay, then on OG, about how domestic news is preferable because it's more valuable, it's relevant to your own life. The first response I have is like, remember that the comparative isn't no information on what's happening around you, because social media gives you information on politics, on advocacy. Like, if you want tips on where to go for pizza, you Google where's the best pizza, and Yelp will tell you, for example. But also because like, I think many like news organizations that are international have regional stuff as well, which means that the most exciting stuff on elections, on corruption, whatever, gets reported on either way. The delta is on granularity, and we would say that the marginal increase in detail has absolutely no value and is in fact really harmful. People truly don't fucking read local news that is about like what their particular Senate governor is doing, for example, or about like what's happening with your like lawyers like economic policy. And the reason for this is A, it's really, really mundane, it's boring, but number two, because it gets really repetitive. Like, there are only so many times I can read about Chris Christie's voting record in the Senate before I'm like, I actually already knew this already. So people literally just stop engaging. They respond by saying, well, it's your local election, your grandparents. So people don't read the news because they want to act on in the future. Like, it's super indirect. They read to be entertained, which is why high quality writing that really draws the reader in is crucial, because the comparative isn't local news. The comparative to international news is TikTok. It's watching cat videos. I think for those reasons, we're the only side that gets people to actually read news of any kind whatsoever. They just turn people off news platforms full stop, and it's incredibly destructive. Happy to oppose.
I'd like to thank that speaker for that speech. And I would like to thank everyone for a great debate. The